Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the second of 3 video lectures about Eileen Chang's 1955 novella, The Rice Sprout Song. I also encourage you to take a look at the brief video lecture I made about Eileen Chang's life and works. In the previous video lecture, I talked about history, specifically the Cold War context of the novel. In this video lecture, I want to talk about how Eileen Chang uses a particular type of atmospherics and motif related to ghosts. There are specters of the revolution that haunt this novel, and I think are part of its power. One of the reasons that it really moves beyond the confines of didactic or propagandistic literature into a new dimension. Eileen Chang takes a Cold War conflict, the ideological battle for mainland China, and turns it into something of a ghost story. Ideologies, as abstract things, are somewhat ghostly in their own ways. They don't have a corporeal presence, although they can be represented through very physical things. And so I want to talk first about the difference between didactic literature and propagandistic literature. I think that Rice Sprout Song is both didactic and propagandistic in some ways, but exactly how it is didactic and propagandistic is, I think, what sets it apart from run-of-the-mill works that espouse a certain ideology. Yet I believe that this novel does something more than just teach or to advocate a certain position or worldview. I think that it is also tapping into a poetics that is much, much deeper, that is not just tied to the early or mid-20th century political moment in China. So the big question that I want to address in this video lecture is, how does Eileen Chang bring the Chinese ghost story with all of its different imaginaries, all of its different possibilities, how does she bring that to bear on contemporary politics in 1955? We'll talk about atmospherics, but we'll also focus on how Eileen Chang uses ghost tales to pinpoint and undercut certain aspects of communist ideology as she interpreted it. And so I think one of the big things that we see in this novel is ghosts are very closely tied to memory and human reconstructions of events that have just happened. This is a novel in which there is a lot of action, but there's also a lot of reflection, a lot of thinking about past events and events that have just occurred and trying to make sense of them and process them psychologically and emotionally. And ghosts have a very important role in this process. 1949, a historical turning point. The communists have defeated the nationalists who have fled to Taiwan. Mao declares the founding of the People's Republic of China. This is an era of great deeds. This is a turning point in history. That historical trend is very commonplace and very easy to identify. However, literary scholars have also identified another trend in mid-20th century China. This is the tendency of writers, artists, filmmakers to adopt a lyrical mode in representing this national divide, this moment of rupture, these cataclysmic grand events of history. Instead of reaching for the epic, they have turned towards a more introspective, often very personal lyrical mode. And what does that mean for a work like the Rice Sprout Song, which, as I mentioned in the previous video lecture, was commissioned by a US government agency as an anti-communist work? Well, we can qualify that a little bit just through biography. Eileen Chang had a personal friend who worked at that agency and helped her get this book contract. Eileen Chang had also just left a communist China that was not very hospitable to a writer like her, who had a very different sensibility and didn't want to sing the party line. The biographical and the Cold War contexts are two prisms through which we can interpret Eileen Chang's works, but I think that they by themselves are insufficient, that we have to look at some other elements too. In 1950, 5 years before The Rice Sprout Song was published, there was a movie released called The White-Haired Girl. The White-Haired Girl had been a stage play, it had been a story, it had been a folktale that was adapted to serve communist ideological purposes. And in the story, this girl suffers abuse by a landlord, she retreats to a cave, she suffers all kinds of privations that cause her hair to turn white. She survives by going down to the local temple to steal offerings, and the superstitious villagers who see this shadowy figure come by at the nighttime think that it is a white-haired immortal girl. But in fact, it's a real human being who has been living this ghost-like, wraith-like existence up in a mountain cave. Eventually, her sweetheart comes back as a member of the Eighth Root Army, liberates her, topples the landlord, and we're left with this slogan: the old society, when the story is set, forced humans to become ghosts. The new society turns ghosts back into humans. So you can see that from early days, the Chinese Communist Party used ghost rhetoric as part of its ideological campaign. And I want to argue that in the Rice Sprout Song, Eileen Chang is turning some of this ghost rhetoric against itself. I view this to be a didactic novel in some ways, and didactic has a couple of meanings. One of the definitions is a neutral definition, that it means to instruct or educate, but there's also a negative connotation to it, meaning that it's very preachy or lecturing, just wants to tell people what to think, and it's boring. And so didactic, I think we could take to be a relative descriptor. Something can be more or less boring, more or less preachy. And you can also read this M.H. Abrams definition that's a little bit more detailed. So if didactic literature seeks to instruct, what would be examples? Well, the Bible has a lot of moral teachings in it, so do Aesop's fables. The Confucian Analects is didactic from start to finish. And then you can also look at works of contemporary literature like Jiang Rong's Wolf Totem, in which there is a representation of Han and Mongolian interactions on the grasslands. And Wolf Totem makes this argument that Han culture should be less ruthless and more symbiotic. There should be some give and take. We shouldn't try to kill all the wolves, because if you kill all the wolves, then all of the grassland will be eaten bare by the gazelles. So you could have a didactic utterance that is just teaching you how to do things, how to make plants grow, or how to put together IKEA furniture. But of course, IKEA could also be propagandizing to get you to buy its furniture in the first place. And so propaganda, I think we could take as being a type of utterance, and in this case, a literary work that is aiming to help or harm a cause. I give that commercial example as something of a joke, but of course there can be a lot of traffic and a lot of interaction between the political and the commercial or economic. But briefly put, propaganda is trying to get you to think something or even take direct action on something. Just a couple of quick examples. Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin wants slavery abolished, and so it is trying to rally support for that cause. Or Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, which is trying to expose and get public condemnation of the exploitative labor practices in Chicago's meatpacking plants. So which elements of the Rice Sprout song are didactic or propagandistic? Well, let me just give a couple of examples. I would say that some of the didacticism of the novel is that it is teaching about the harsh reality of life under the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. The propagandistic element of it, however, is that it is encouraging opposition to communist rule in mainland China. What I'm arguing in this video lecture is that ghosts are both a vehicle of didacticism and propaganda, and also something that kind of moves beyond those worlds, that draw on a deeper poetics related to how humans remember things, how they represent things, and of course, how they misrepresent things based on their own desires. So one of the fundamental problematics that I see in this novel is that there's a kind of tension or an incompatibility being presented between physical material needs and more intangible needs, be they spiritual needs or emotional needs or ideological needs. Again and again, they come into conflict with each other. So just one easy example. Comrade Ku is supposed to be positive about all of the party's policies, everything is going great in the countryside, but the reality is that he is suffering from hunger. And when the peasants discover that he has been eating food in his room on the sly, what they have discovered is essentially that he has betrayed the ideology by giving in to his physical material needs. This is also a novel with many, many ghosts in it. We have this long backstory about Comrade Wang, who is haunted by things that happened before the revolution was won, and then these come back to haunt him yet again after the burning of the granary. We also have Comrade Ku, who sees ghosts at different points in the narrative. Before Moon Sen dies, Big Aunt once thinks of her as having already died. And then after Moon Sen does die, Big Aunt thinks of her as a type of immortal or a spirit or a supernatural being. The Rice Sprout song in itself could also be taken as a dance of death. We have the dance scene right at the very end of the novel after all of these characters have died, but we're still dancing on, and even amidst the dance, you have the corpses of slaughtered animals. Back in the 1910s and 1920s, in the early years of the Republic, you had leading intellectuals talking about the modern project as essentially one of purging one's own personal ghosts, getting all of these specters of Confucianism in the past out of one's consciousness in order to be a new, living, breathing person. So you have Zhou Zuoren, Lu Xun's brother, calling for a literature of the human, or Hu Shi, a leading member of the May 4th movement who later became Chinese ambassador to the United States. He took pride in being able to chain his own demons and subdue his own ghosts, which is a very interesting thing. He's not saying that he actually vanquished them. He's almost realizing that this part of the imagination at most can just be shackled down. In the 20th century, there has also been a lot of use of ghosts as a type of political rhetoric to say that the past is all ghosts or our enemies are devils, they're all gui. And so we want to vanquish the devils, we want to exorcise them from our country, from our consciousness. in order, again, to become human. In the 1940s through the 1950s and 1960s, the communists launched a bunch of anti-superstition campaigns in their sphere of influence, especially against popular religion. And in the 1960s and 1970s, during the Cultural Revolution, there was a concerted campaign. Really, the opening salvo of the Cultural Revolution was to sweep away all of these ox demons and snake spirits. That's what they dubbed political enemies. But can you ever really get rid of ghosts? One early Chinese definition of the term ghost, or gui, is that which returns. Gui, so there's even a homophonic connection between them in Mandarin. And we could link this poetics to the modern Freudian notion of the return of the repressed, and that society keeps asking us to repress our desires, repress our emotions, to fit into society, to be very rational and logical, but essentially to push down all of the traumatic experiences we've had in childhood or in our past. However, in Freudian thought, these repressed feelings and emotions keep bubbling up to the surface in different ways. Sometimes we unconsciously reveal them when we make a joke that expresses our desire in an indirect way, or else maybe when we write literature, we don't realize that we are actually revealing some of our repressed desires and emotions. Or we may project those desires and emotions onto other people, as if we have purged them and put them on someone else's shoulders. But because of all of this psychological and emotional effort to suppress and to exorcise, when the repressed does come back, it can feel very uncanny, like we've seen it before, but it somehow seems a little bit different. And so these repressed desires and memories of trauma, they don't just come back once, but they come back again and again and again. In many traditions, ghosts represent a number of things. Here I want to highlight how they are connected to memory. They keep coming back. They haunt us. They are both there and not there. So like memories, the memory is not the actual thing. It is just an abstract construction in our psychology of that thing that is no longer there. So we may remember, if it's a dead person, that the body is gone, but the memory of that person lives on. And so there's this pull and push within the concept of ghost that it seems like it's there, but it's not, because it doesn't take full form. With ghosts, as with memories, there's a perception of difference. We know that the ghost is not the person. We know that the memory is not the thing or event itself. So when we discover that similarity yet difference, that is the feeling of the uncanny. And of course, ghosts are not just neutral things, and so they can provoke very strong emotions because they are often symbols of desire. And among other things, ghosts represent the inability of human beings, in many cases, to accept the finality of death. So think about Comrade Wong and what a haunted man he is. We get this long backstory in chapter 6 that essentially presents him as a man who is trying to cope with having been wronged and abandoned. He married this young woman, but then she was taken away from him. And we have this description of their brief relationship together and how he tries to process all of this feeling of loss after she disappears under mysterious circumstances which he doesn't fully understand at first. They were both party members. They were both fighting for the revolution together. They had a glorious future ahead of them. But then she essentially goes AWOL. She disappears. So this is a very odd moment that Wong represents here, where he is left behind. The party is his refuge. It is not his destiny anymore. So in Comrade Wong's backstory, we have this figure who should be empowered by the past, by what has happened. Instead, he is haunted by it. So even after the revolution is won and everyone should be elated, he carries this loss with him. So we have this very real presence of the past in Comrade Wong's present, in his psyche, and that affects how he behaves. In an early description of Xiaoming, we see her through Comrade Wong's consciousness as something that's already lost one dimension. It's already a two-dimensional, fading photograph, and if he touches her, if there's any physical contact, she will fade further. So there's an anticipation of loss, even from early in this character's introduction. And when they do actually have physical contact, it is interpreted through like a ghost story motif, that she is a ghost mistress who is visiting him in this temple at night. And we have this old nun's prayers, the sound, very spooky sound, keeping them company. Xiaoming then disappears. Wong is still marching in the army, though he's bereft. And at one point they're passing through a town, and he thinks he sees her at the window of a building. But when he goes to investigate, he discovers that the building has been destroyed. It's just a facade. And so he thinks that he has seen a ghost, and he's absolutely terrified. Comrade Ku is also haunted. When he sees Moon Scent, he's very attracted to her, so he's very desiring. But she also seems to him like a bit of a shade, like she has stepped out of the pages of a ghost novel from the Qing dynasty. The stories of Pu Songling and of Yuan Mei, a high official who spent his retirement collecting and writing ghost stories, these were exactly the type of superstitious tales that the Communist Party was trying to get rid of. So to have the two main representatives of the party thinking about the present, post-revolution, as being a kind of haunted place full of these walking ghosts is very, very problematic from an ideological standpoint. We can see the return of the repressed being staged later in the novel. For example, when Ku is listening to the sound of villagers being tortured after they have made this attempt on the granary. And torture is supposed to be a thing of the past. It has no place in the revolution. And so Gu is trying to repress the reality that he is hearing because it should not be coming back. He wants to scream and make it all go away. So the pattern that we're seeing here is a kind of projection where Eileen Chang is having her communist revolutionaries interpret the revolutionary present in terms of the ghost stories of the past. We can also see the return of the repressed in Comrade Wang's reaction to thinking that he has seen his wife come back to visit him as a ghost. Psychologically and emotionally, he feels elated, but then his training steps in and tells him that it's just superstitious and that he must be going crazy. It turns out that there is a very mundane and rational explanation for her disappearance, that she has remarried someone else. But this is the type of reality precisely that Comrade Wang wants to deny. He would prefer to live in this ghost fantasy realm. Comrade Wang has served the party for many years, but he experiences a lot of anger, frustration, and disappointment. So after the revolution is won, party policy turns these old cadres, who should be feeling empowered, into mere shades of their former selves. Comrade Wang's story would be just one example I see in the novel of Eileen Chang reversing or inverting party logic, of ghosts being turned back into humans after the revolution is won, because Wang retreats into this supernatural story that he tells himself about why his wife left, even though the reality is completely mundane. And he should be very anti-superstition, but he kind of clings to superstition instead. Wang is also haunted by the deaths being caused by the party right now, like in the suppression of the granary riot. Moonscent also dies. She was a human before, now she's been turned into a ghost. The Rice Sprout song brings together these different threads: didacticism, anti-communist propaganda, and ghost stories. You have the presentation of a ruling party and its agents who keep telling people that things are getting better all the time. The ideology being expressed is one of continual revolutionary progress. However, Eileen Chang interweaves this with ghost logic. The ghost logic is not one of progress. It is one of repetition. It is one of haunting. And it is one that reminds us that however much you may try to suppress the ghosts of the past, they will keep coming back to haunt you.